Senator Lankford.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for the work that you do all the time on this issue and continue to raise it. I have a philosophical statement that I want to make and want to be able to get from you, and then I want to get some very practical things on it. One is, talk me through, and I'm going to ask each of you to just make a quick comment on this, and I'll take that, begin with the bishop first on it, and work all the way across the ambassador. The difference between freedom of religion and freedom of worship, because that has become a much discussed issue in the days ahead of what is the American value. Is this about freedom of religion or freedom of worship? Any thoughts that you may have on that philosophical question? I want to come back with some practical things as well. Bishop?
We need both. And freedom of worship is much more limited. If we might have a visual, it's within the walls. Freedom of religion is practiced 7 days a week, not just on whichever day we're within the walls of the temple or the church or the synagogue.
Thank you. Mr. Secular?
Well, I think Senator, I think the best thing to do is look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18, which states that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. That would assume both freedom of religion and freedom of worship. And then the individual international documents, international obligations that these governments have signed on have also protected religious worship. I would also add that in addition to our view of, in the United States, of religious freedom, that it subsumes also religious worship, the European Court of Human Rights, where we've litigated cases, they've recognized that religious freedom and worship go together. So I think that trying to separate those two becomes I think they're part and parcel of the same.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Perkins?
Well, with Jay Sekulow to the right of me, there's not much left for me to say. I think we go back to international law and the Human Rights Declaration. It sums it up that it is the ability to live it out. Freedom of worship is a truncated view of the freedom of religion. The freedom of religion is the ability to live your life, not just within the four walls of your church or the four walls of your home, but to be able to take it into the marketplace, to be able to take it into the broader culture. That's what America has long stood for and protected both here and abroad. And that is what is at risk, we see both domestically and internationally.
Right. Mr. Ambassador?
Freedom of religion is absolutely central. Freedom of worship is absolutely central. It doesn't cover freedom to educate your children, freedom to speak out on your religious beliefs, freedom to proselytize others, freedom to get together in group activities beyond worship. It doesn't include the right of people to choose with the faith that they want, or to believe, choose not to believe if they want, the right to convert. All of those are covered under international accords by freedom of religion. It's very important. I was delighted that the Secretary at my swearing in used freedom of religion. Here the President has used freedom of religion. It is important that be the message going out to the world.
And we had the Secretary in front of one of the other committees just a few weeks ago, and that was highlighted to him and was appreciated by Senator Blunt actually as well, to publicly acknowledge the fact that he used freedom of religion, which we believe is the appropriate and is also the constitutional term on it, be able to practice. That's important not only in our country, which is a beacon to the world, that when Navy chaplains are told what they can and can't do, when individual schools or state schools shut down, the practice to be able to practice your own religion on campus, these become serious challenges to our example to the world of living out freedom of religion. So when that gets diminished here, it becomes a serious issue of trying to shine that beacon in other places as well. I do want to ask some pragmatic things. Mr. Ambassador, talk me through, in your beginning months here, as you look at the list of options in your toolkit on being able to promote religious liberty around the world, what are the tools that you see as the practical levers of power that you can pull to help spread this value and this dignity to humanity worldwide?
Senator Lankford, I began to actually list some of them. We have the CPC designation.
Right, which I have some questions about.
Okay, and they are important in terms of naming, and they are important in terms of sanctions when the sanctions are applied under those rules. Secondly, we have the bilateral engagement that goes on day in, day out on behalf of political prisoners of conscience, of religious prisoners of conscience, on behalf of groups that are discriminated against, whether, all across the globe. We are constantly constantly speaking to governments, encouraging them to withdraw bad laws that they may be considering, to change the law to allow for more freedom of religion. We do have visa bans, and one of the things I've done, they have not been used enough, and I've instructed my staff to look for a more robust set of recommendations that we can make on behalf of this. And we have the power of the pulpit of the world here, the ability to speak out and to inspire others here, and to convince them that this is not just good in and of itself, but it's good for the kind of stability and openness and tolerance that will create a better society for their own citizens as well.
Let me ask, has your staff been consulting, or you've been engaged at all in the early days of this process with any trade negotiations with Asia? There's a lot of conversation back and forth right now. Vietnam is one of those nations that's in the middle of this conversation. Obvious religious liberty issues there. Has your staff, or have you been involved in any of the conversations about any trade negotiations?
The TPP negotiations, we've not been consulted on per se, but we have been involved with all of the offices that are involved with those negotiations on the general role of considering religious freedom in our bilateral relations.
Have you had enough access? Have you had enough access in that conversation?
Again, we have not been consulted directly on that, but we have had more than adequate access to the offices that are dealing with it in our general work.
Okay. What about you mentioned before the countries of particular concern, the CPC. Obviously, there are quite a few countries that are not on that list, Vietnam being one of them, Pakistan being one of them, Syria actually being one of them. What's the process for that right now to be able to move that along?
With every country that we consider, and we get a lot of recommendations from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, from outside organizations like those represented at the table here, and all of that is considered. Every country is analyzed. Recommendations are made. There may be countries that have serious problems, but don't quite reach the legal definition of egregious systemic forms of persecution here, whether they are on the CPC list or not. All of those countries, if they've made it to the point where we would be considering them, all of those countries get our attention and concern, and we develop plans of how to move them in a better direction. But ultimately, it is the president designated over to the secretary who will make the final decision once reviewing all the materials we've put together.
Do you have the freedom of access to be able to make those recommendations, say we have real concerns and we would encourage this elevation of this conversation?
Both the office has the freedom of access, and I personally have that freedom of access, as the secretary has testified publicly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. I do hope, I ran out of time, but I do hope one of the other panelists will talk about the vacant position on the envoy for religious liberty issues in the Middle East, and I yield back.